A muddy ladder shook under his boots while the empty canal stretched out like a long, cracked scar through the middle of the city. Luis's phone wouldn't stop vibrating in his pocket, the same debt collector number lighting up the screen again and again. He ignored it and kept climbing down anyway, one hand gripping the cold metal, the other holding a flashlight that kept blinking like it was tired too. Above him, a supervisor yelled something he couldn't hear over the pump engines, and somewhere on the street level a car alarm chirped like nothing in the world was wrong. At the bottom, the air smelled like wet rust and old algae, like time itself had been sitting here too long. He aimed the beam across the muck and saw it. Not a body. Not treasure. Something worse in a different way. A child's backpack, faded and stuck half in the sludge, with a bright orange keychain still hanging from the zipper. The kind you buy at a gas station when a kid begs for it. Luis's throat tightened before his brain could catch up. He stood there, staring, and felt a strange pressure behind his eyes like his own life was about to spill out of him in front of everyone. They called it the San Mero Canal, but nobody in Sacramento actually called it that anymore. People just said the canal, like it was an old neighbor everyone complained about but still expected to be there. It cut behind strip malls and apartment blocks, ran under bridges covered in faded murals, and passed close enough to a coffee shop where a barista knew exactly how Luis took his iced Americano when he could afford it. For years it held water that moved slow and brown, like it didn't want to go anywhere. And then, at the start of the week, the city posted signs and orange cones and announced the drainage. Maintenance. Inspection. Repairs. People posted videos of the water lowering like it was satisfying content, like a slow reveal that had nothing to do with real lives. Luis did not have time for satisfying content. He was 36, with a lower back that felt older than that and a bank account that never stayed still for more than a day. Every time he thought he was even, a bill showed up. Every time he thought he could breathe, something else tightened around his chest. The last month had been a chain of small humiliations. A late fee for his car insurance. A warning email from his landlord written in that polite tone that made it feel colder. A text from his ex Maya about their son's field trip money, followed by a second text that was just a question mark when he didn't answer fast enough. Luis loved his kid more than he knew how to explain, but love didn't pay the school, and the shame of that sat on him like wet clothes. He worked for a city contractor doing infrastructure cleanup and utility repairs, the kind of job most people only noticed when it blocked traffic. It meant early mornings, heavy gloves, and lunches eaten in the cab of a truck that smelled like dust and old fast food. It also meant he was never home enough to feel like he had a home. His apartment was a one-bedroom in South Natomas with a dishwasher that didn't drain and a neighbor who played TV too loud at night. Luis kept it clean anyway. Not because it impressed anyone, but because it made him feel like he had one small area where things followed rules. The day they started sending crews down into the drained canal, Luis showed up late because he had to jump-start his car again. He stood in the parking lot rubbing his hands together, watching his breath disappear in the cool morning air, and tried not to think about how thin his patience had gotten. A co-worker named Darnell clapped him on the shoulder and asked if he was good. Luis said yeah, the way people say yeah when they mean the opposite. Everyone was doing some version of that lately. The city had been cutting hours. The contractor was pushing deadlines. People were tired in a way that wasn't dramatic, just constant. At the worksite, the canal looked different without water. It wasn't romantic or mysterious. It looked like a mess. The walls were stained with years of grime. The bottom was a stretch of mud, trash, and broken things. Shopping carts. Bike parts. A cracked microwave. Luis tried not to imagine the stories behind all of it. He was good at not imagining things. It was a skill he built over years of trying to survive. The supervisor, a woman named Karen who wore a hard hat with a city logo and always looked like she was late to something, gave instructions like she was reading off a list in her mind. Watch your footing. Don't touch anything sharp. Report anything unusual. They were there to clear debris and check for erosion, to make the city look good, to make it safe again.
It sounded simple.
Simple was rare in Louis's life. He climbed down into the canal with Darnell and another worker, Ben. The mud sucked at their boots. The air felt heavy. Louis kept his flashlight low and his head down. He told himself it was just another job.
Get in, get out. Don't think too much.
His phone buzzed again. He didn't look. If he looked and it was the collector, he'd feel the panic rise. If it was Maya, he'd feel the guilt. Either way, he would lose focus. And down here, losing focus could mean a sprained ankle or worse, and he couldn't afford either. They worked slowly, pulling trash into bags, marking cracks in the wall, calling up to the crew above when they needed a rope or a new tool. Louis's hands moved automatically. His mind, though, kept drifting to a different kind of emptiness. The kind that showed up when he dropped his son off at Maya's and the door closed behind them. The kind that showed up when he sat alone at night and scrolled through photos of better times, not because he wanted to go back, but because he wanted to remember that he had once been a version of himself who laughed easily. Then, halfway down the canal stretch, Louis saw the backpack. It was half buried, the top flap caked with mud.
The orange cake kind dangled like a small brick flag.
He froze. His chest went tight. For a second he saw his son, Mateo, at age 8, wearing a backpack with a little dinosaur patch and running ahead of him at the park. He felt a rush of fear that didn't make sense for a stranger's backpack, and then it made sense because fear didn't ask permission. It just arrived. Louis crouched and brushed mud away with his gloved fingers. The fabric was worn. There was a name written in marker on the inside tag, letters smeared but still readable. He read it twice to make sure his eyes weren't playing games. A kid's name. Not Mateo. Thank God. But still a kid. Still someone who had carried this like it mattered. Louis swallowed hard and called out to Darnell, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in a while. Darnell came over and looked, and his face changed in a quiet way, the way grown men try to keep themselves steady. Karen's voice came down from above, asking what it was. Louis stared at the backpack and felt something inside him shift, like a door that had been stuck finally cracked open. He didn't know why it hit him so hard. Maybe because he was already full of worry and this was one more weight. Maybe because it reminded him that kids didn't get to choose where life dropped them. Maybe because he had been telling himself his problems were the whole world, and suddenly the world felt bigger and sadder. He stood up slowly and looked along the canal bed, scanning the mud. And that was when he noticed the second thing. A small plastic lunch container, the kind with cartoon stickers on the lid, wedged near a broken slab of concrete. The stickers were peeling but still cheerful. Louis felt his throat tighten again. Above them, traffic rolled by. People went to work. People bought coffee. People argued about nothing on the internet. And down here, stuck in the mud, were pieces of a life that didn't feel like content at all. Louis lifted the backpack carefully and held it like it could break. His phone buzzed again. He finally looked. It was Maya. 3 words. Are you okay? Louis stared at the message and felt something strange. Not relief. Not anger. Just the shock of being asked that simple question on a day when he didn't know how to answer. He typed back 1 word. Yeah. Then he looked at the backpack again and realized he had lied. Louis stayed near the edge of the canal, even after the supervisor told the crew to pause for a break because something about walking away felt wrong to him, and the backpack now sealed inside a clear bag sat on a folding table between orange cones like it carried its own gravity, and people moved around it slower than before, careful without being told, and Louis kept his gloves on even though his hands were shaking inside them while his mind kept arguing with itself that it was only an object left behind like many others, but his chest refused to accept that simple explanation. A city police officer arrived without hurry carrying a notepad and the tired calm of someone who had seen many ordinary heavy moments, and she asked Luis a few questions about where he found the backpack, and whether anything else was nearby, and he answered quietly, noticing how her eyes stayed gentle the whole time, and when she finished she told him kids lose things often, and that sometimes those things end up in strange places, and that it does not always mean the worst, which was a sentence Luis wanted to hold on to, even though he was not sure he believed it yet. The crew gathered near the truck with paper cups of lukewarm coffee, and a few weak jokes that fell flat, and Luis sat apart staring into his cup, feeling a strange resistance inside him because part of him wanted to shut down and treat the day like every other job, while another part felt like something inside him had already cracked open and could not be sealed back up so easily. During lunch he sat alone on the tailgate of the truck while the dry canal stretched behind him quiet and exposed, and his phone buzzed again, but this time it was his son Mateo sending a photo from school where he stood holding a crooked paper solar system with a message saying, "Dad, I got a star sticker today," and Luis smiled before he could stop himself, and then felt his eyes burn, so he set the phone down and stared at the ground until he could breathe normally again. An older man walked over from the sidewalk pushing a cart filled with cans and wearing a faded hoodie, and he stopped near the cones and looked down into the canal, saying he used to fish there when he was a kid, and Luis nodded, not sure what to say, while the man kept talking about how the city changes quietly without telling you when it is finished changing, and then the man noticed the backpack, and his voice softened as he said it must belong to a kid, and shared how his own daughter once lost her shoes near the canal years ago, and they never found them, but she was okay, and grew up fine, and that small story loosened something tight in Luis' chest just a little. The man wished him a good day and pushed his cart away, and Luis watched him go, feeling steadier than before, not because anything was fixed, but because the moment felt human. And later in the afternoon a woman from community outreach arrived, introducing herself as Elena, and thanking Luis personally for finding the items, and she explained calmly that they would try to track the owner through reports, and that sometimes families call late embarrassed and hopeful, and sometimes they never call, and her honesty did not scare Luis as much as he expected. Before leaving, Elena asked how he was doing, and the question caught him off guard because it did not feel routine, and instead of the automatic answer he admitted quietly that the last few months had been hard without giving details, and Elena nodded like she understood anyway, and told him that reminders involving kids can shake adults deeply, and that it was okay to feel that way, before handing him a small card with local resources which he slipped into his wallet without knowing if he would ever use it, but noticing he did not throw it away. As the sun lowered, the crew packed up, and Luis climbed out of the canal for the last time that day, feeling sore but strangely alert, and on the drive home he left the radio off, letting the sound of the road fill the space, and when he stopped at a red light he checked his phone and saw a message from Maya asking if he could come to Mateo open house next week, and instead of calculating excuses he thought about the backpack, the quiet conversations, and how easily pieces of life can slip away, and he typed back that he would be there, and drove on, feeling no sudden joy, just a quiet awareness that something inside him had shifted and been noticed. Luis woke before his alarm the next morning, staring at the ceiling of his apartment, while gray light pressed through the blinds, and his body felt heavy, like it already knew the day would ask for more than he had planned to give, and he lay there listening to the neighbor television through the wall, wondering how someone else could sound so awake so early while he felt stuck between tired and restless. At work, the canal looked the same, but Luis did not feel the same inside, and every step along the cracked concrete felt louder than before, like the space was paying attention now, and he kept thinking about the backpack, even though it was no longer there, and about how quickly something important could sink out of sight without anyone noticing for a long time. They sent him farther down the canal that day to inspect an older section where the walls leaned slightly inward, and the mud was thicker, and the smell sharper, and while he worked his mind kept drifting back to moments he usually avoided thinking about, like the night Maya told him she was tired of waiting for things to get better, and the way he nodded instead of arguing because he did not trust his own promises anymore. Luis had always believed that if he just worked harder things would line up eventually, and that belief carried him for years until it quietly failed him, and standing there in the drained canal, he realized how long he had been running on that idea, even after it stopped giving anything back, and the realization sat heavy in his chest. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was the debt collector, and he let it ring out, feeling his jaw tighten because answering would not change the number, and ignoring it would not make it disappear either, and he felt trapped between those two truths which seemed to define most of his adult life lately. He thought about Mateo and the open house coming up and the field trip money, and the way his son looked at him like he still believed his dad could handle anything, and that thought hurt more than the bills because it carried hope inside it, and hope felt risky when you were already stretched thin. During the afternoon heat, Luis stopped working for a moment and leaned against the canal wall, letting the rough concrete press into his back, and he closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while he asked himself a question he usually avoided, which was, what happens if I keep going like this? And the answer that came was quiet but clear, and it scared him because it was not dramatic, it was just empty. He realized then that his breaking point was not about money or work, or even the backpack, but about how small his life had become without him noticing, and how he had been surviving instead of living, and telling himself that was enough because he did not know how to ask for more. When the shift ended, he drove past his apartment without planning to and found himself parked outside the elementary school where Mateo went, and the building was quiet, empty classrooms glowing faintly in the late afternoon sun, and Luis sat in the car gripping the steering wheel, feeling tears come without warning because the place reminded him of everything he wanted to be present for and everything he was afraid of failing at. He thought about the backpack again and imagined a parent somewhere searching for it, replaying moments, wondering what they missed, and that thought finally broke through the wall he had built around himself because he saw how easily he could become that person, always looking back, always wishing he had noticed sooner. Luis pulled out his phone and stared at Maya contact for a long time before calling, and when she answered he almost hung up, but he did not, and he told her he was struggling in a voice that sounded unfamiliar even to him because it was honest, and Maya listened without interrupting, and did not rush to fix anything, and that alone made his chest feel lighter. They talked about Mateo and schedules and money in a calm way that surprised him, and when the call ended nothing had magically improved, but Luis felt less alone than he had in months, and that felt like standing on solid ground after floating too long. That night at home he sat at the small kitchen table with unpaid bills spread out in front of him, and instead of avoiding them he made a simple list of what had to be handled first and what could wait, and the act was small but it steadied him because it meant he was choosing to face things instead of letting them pile up silently. Before going to bed he took out the card Elena had given him and read it again, and for the first time he did not feel embarrassed holding it, and he placed it on the counter where he could see it in the morning. As he lay down, Luis felt the weight of the day settle over him, but underneath it there was something new, not relief, not confidence, but awareness, and he understood that the breaking point was not about falling apart, but about finally admitting that he could not carry everything alone, and that maybe noticing that truth was the beginning of something different, even if he did not know what it would look like yet. Luis woke the next morning to sunlight instead of his alarm, and for a moment he did not panic about the time, and that alone felt new because usually his first thought was what he was late for, or what he could not afford, and he lay there listening to the quiet of the apartment, noticing how ordinary it was, and how that ordinary feeling suddenly felt like something worth protecting. The day moved forward without any big changes, and that surprised him because he had expected something dramatic after the heaviness of the night before, but work was work and traffic was traffic, and his phone still buzzed with reminders, yet the difference was small and internal because he answered one call instead of letting it ring, and set up a payment plan that did not fix everything but stopped the feeling of free fall. At the job site, the Canal inspection continued, and Luis worked steadily, not rushing, not hiding either. And when he passed the spot where he had found the backpack, he paused for a second longer than necessary, and felt a quiet sadness mixed with gratitude, because that moment had forced him to look at his own life in a way he had avoided, and he realized that some warnings do not come loudly, they come as reminders buried in ordinary places. During lunch he sat with Darnell instead of alone, and they talked about nothing important, and that felt important because Luis noticed how isolation had become a habit rather than a choice, and breaking that habit, even once, made the day feel lighter and more human. That evening he stopped by a discount store and bought a simple notebook, and when he got home he wrote down his schedule, his bills, and Mateo upcoming school dates, not because it solved anything but because it made the future feel less like a fog and more like something he could step through one day at a time. The open house came faster than he expected, and when Luis walked into the classroom, Mateo's face lit up in a way that erased a week worth of exhaustion, and they stood together looking at projects taped to the walls, and for the first time in a long while Luis felt fully present, not worrying about what came next, not apologizing in advance, just standing there listening to his son explain things with serious pride. Maya watched them from across the room, and later they spoke quietly near the door about schedules and money, and how things were still hard, but the conversation stayed calm and respectful, and Luis understood that quiet cooperation was its own kind of progress and did not need to look like reconciliation to matter. On the drive home, Mateo talked about small things like friends and snacks and a field trip, and Luis listened carefully, aware of how easily moments like this could be missed when life felt overwhelming, and he promised himself not perfection but attention which felt more realistic and more possible. Weeks passed, and the canal refilled with water, slowly covering the exposed bottom, until it looked like it always had, and most people forgot about the drainage entirely. But Luis did not, because the memory stayed with him as a reminder that just because something is hidden does not mean it is gone, and that noticing matters. One afternoon he received a brief update from Elena saying the backpack had been returned to its owner, and that the family was relieved and grateful, and Luis sat in his car reading the message, feeling a quiet release because the story did not end in tragedy, it ended in relief, and that felt like enough. That night he sat on his couch with a notebook open beside him, and Mateo homework spread across the table, and he realized that his life was still imperfect, still fragile, but no longer invisible to himself, and that was the small win, because paying attention had changed how he moved through the world. Luis understood now that resilience was not about carrying everything alone or pretending things did not hurt, but about allowing yourself to notice when something mattered and choosing to respond instead of turning away. And as he turned off the lights, he held on to that thought, knowing that many people watching his story might recognize themselves in it, and that maybe they too had found something unexpected at the bottom of their own drained canals, without realizing it yet.